A couple of weeks ago, I started to share some ideas on investment, and I came up with a number of sessions where I shared some ideas. But perhaps I should take a step back and explain the reasons. I, I found myself in a conversation, in a conversation um, in a group where we were exchanging ideas or we were um, conversing. And during the conversation, one person made a reference to a financial transaction that they were just about to engage in. I listened, I, I observed, and I came up with a conclusion that the decisions they were making, unfortunately, although they had sought financial advice, that the decision they were making was a poor one. I subsequently, uh, with humility, obviously, with consent, by asking if it was okay to share some ideas, I shared some thoughts. I usually try to be very careful these days. Probably should have learned that much earlier, but I try these days to be careful in what I say, especially when you're giving recommendations or advice to people. Nowadays, I try to tell people what I do, what I'm doing, and what I intend to do. In some scenarios, I might tell people what I would do if I were in their shoes. There is a saying that until you've walked a day in my moccasins, you haven't earned the right um, to advise me or to critique my decisions. And I think that's such an important observation. When you give advice, the person giving the advice is transferring some risk. The risk arises as a result of the learners or the inexperience of the audience in identifying something you said, but applying what you said in the wrong way. Or the risk arises from the learner or the observer or the audience missing out on the most critical part of what you said. You know, I can give you a lock and there's a code. If there are four codes you need to enter to unlock the lock, you might find that if you have three of the codes and you miss out, or you do not have the fourth, the lock won't open. And I found lately that in giving people advice, it was important to recognize that we're all cut, although from the same cloth, but we experience life differently. And that means your experiences, or my experiences, and the perception that I have, and the way my worldview is very different to someone else's. And so, what you should do is tell people what you would do if you were in their shoes. And as much as you can, resist from telling them what to do. Now, I make that mistake almost every single time I try to share an idea. But we go back to the conversation that I had. I tried to explain how I would do it differently, and I realized that it was falling on deaf ears. Um, there's something that I think is worth sharing. I believe it was the great mathematician who said that Charles Darwin, who said, well, he was a mathematician and but also a scientist, who said that whenever he came across an idea that contradicted a previously cherished belief, that he made a point of writing it down because the human mind was so conditioned to reject anything that was different to what it believed. Now think about that. And he said he had to write that down within 30 minutes. Otherwise, his subconscious, his conditioning would reject the idea. And so as I spoke to and as I shared my idea, I realized that it fell on deaf ears. And as I went home, I felt sad. I felt sad because I wish that I had someone telling me or sharing ideas to make my future less painful. Because you see, we live and we experience and we are effectively responsible for the decisions we make. Our decisions determine the direction we travel, and our direction determines our destination. So whatever future you have, it's a product, it's a result, it's an outcome from a decision you made, explicitly or implicitly. Anyway, I realized that it was difficult for the person to accept an idea that was different to what they had already accepted, or a conclusion that they had come up with. As a matter of fact, the person felt a little bit challenged by the fact that they couldn't accept, although there was still a window to make an improvement. In other words, to go and correct the error. This was not a case of the decision had been made and could not be rescinded. No, this was a case of a decision had been made and there was still a window of opportunity to correct it. But ego, trying to save face, would not allow the person to make a change, although it was in their financial best interest and their economic best interest, and in more than anything, in their well-being to do otherwise. Now, there's a saying, when I come across new facts and new insights, I change my mind. What do you do? Anyway, when I got back home, I realized, waking up the next morning, that I felt quite sad. I felt sad simply because, and I spoke to a friend of mine about this. I said, I feel really sad because most financial advisors are not looking out for your best interest. They are looking out for their best interest. And therefore, sometimes what they sell you is based on what's best for them. They might get an incentive, they might get a kickback from selling you a product. They might come across as being enlightened and looking out for your interest, but no, they are not. And I said to my friend, I wish I could have done more. And as I went to bed and I woke up the next morning, I said to myself, well, I think I will restart my sharing session, try to share more ideas. And that was the reason why I began the investment session or series, which you may have seen or you may not have seen. In any case, the reason I started that session was because when I pondered on the advice I provided, one of the first thoughts that came to my mind, because I kept asking the question, why? Why couldn't I be effective? One of the ideas that came through my mind was because people have a right to choose and they have the free will, and you must respect that, which I agree with. Secondly, I said because sometimes the teacher might be ready, but the pupil, the student, is not ready. And I came up with a third one, that my role is to share my ideas, or to share what I believe to be good ideas that could help people, but not to choose where the seeds begin to grow. In other words, you scatter the seeds and let them fall where they fall. Some will fall on good ground and some will not. And the wise thing to do was to continue to share the seeds and let it fall where it falls. And if it bears fruit, great. If it doesn't, that's okay too. But here was the most important thing I realized. I realized that I had disqualified myself from critiquing or judging their decision until I had provided my teaching. And so I realized, I said, well, the best thing I can do is to teach. I've often said this. It's much easier to love than to understand people. It's much easier to love than to understand. So if you have loved ones, if you have friends and family, work colleagues, rather than say, I need to understand why you did what you did, I need to understand why you do what you do, it's easier to just love them. Love is so much easier. Likewise, it's much easier to teach than to try and change people. And so I decided I disqualified myself from critiquing until I had provided some teaching. And so I started the session. Anyway, I'd like to move forward to why I brought this up today. We live in unprecedented times. It's, in my opinion, I think as a result of this public health epidemic, which will lead to an economic, in my opinion, experience that we've never seen before, potentially. I thought to myself and I said, well, how can I be of value? There are some ideas I have in mind. There are some things that I am doing. But how selfish would it be for me to keep my ideas and my actions to myself? And so I thought I should start another series. And this series will be a short one. And it will simply be about trying to share some ideas about how to deal with the events that are occurring right now in this present time. I'll give an overview, but my intention is not to begin the session today. This is simply, I guess, laying the foundations. Let me paint a picture for you. We see this epidemic as some people as an inconvenience. Now, hear me out now. Now, I should say this before I continue. I am going to say a few things that would upset you, possibly. It's not my intention. I care more about your future than I do about your feelings, as a matter of fact. I'm not here looking for a like or a thumbs up or words from you telling me how much you like what I shared. I'm more interested in change. Now, people do not resist change. People resist being changed. And that means that in most cases, the ideas I share, if they conflict or contradict your philosophy, your approach, you would reject it because I'm forcing you, through your conscience, I'm forcing you to change. I will say this, however, I'd like you to see this conversation as a catalyst, encouraging you, not employing you, but encouraging you to consider changing yourself. Now, why am I interested in this times or the present time we find ourselves in? 154 countries have been affected by this public health experience. I'm not here to talk about why. I don't care much about the reasons. I'm not here to talk about what could be in relation to how bad it could get. I'm not here to talk about who is to blame. That is irrelevant. Let's leave that to the pundits. Let's leave that to the news media and those who are more intelligent than I am. I'm here to talk about and to share how you and I can make the best of the experience and the opportunity we've been given. I'm going to focus on the economic side. Why? Because it's so easy to measure. We live in 3 planes of understanding. What that means is simply you and I, our personality, comes in 3 parts. There's the spiritual, there's the mental, there's the physical. The physical is easy to address because we can relate to it. The metaphysical and the spiritual is a little bit sometimes too over the top. I'm going to begin with economics, and I'll link economics to what's going on. It's important you recognize, like I said, my intention is not to make you happy, make you excited, not even to motivate you. My intention is to enlighten you, and hopefully you find something of value. If you ask most people, what do you think about the social structure in any country? One of the things that seems to be a common theme is most people say there is inequality, there is imbalance, that you have the haves and the have-nots, that wealth is stored up for a few and poverty is spread amongst the many. Nothing can be further from the truth. Now, I'm not here to preach about inequality or inequity or redistribution of income. No. All I'm saying is history does not repeat itself, as Mark Twain once said, but it rhymes. To understand what we are going through or what we potentially could be going into, you have to go back to an analogous period, the 1929 period. If you study financial markets from 1913 all the way up to 1927, it was quite interesting. We went through a period, the 10-year prior to the 1929 crash, we went through a period of boom and optimism and euphoria and the stock market going up. Then we had a recession. The 1929 recession or 1929-1930 recession lasted a short period. However, as a result of some actions by the government, it led to a depression, which was catastrophic. During that period, we saw the decimation of wealth. Stock markets, equity portfolios lost 50+% of their value. It was painful. That period is very similar to what we potentially could be going through. Now, I don't say that to scare you. I simply say that to get you excited. And the reason is why. I'm going to give you a teaser because I do not intend to go into the detail in this session. I'm going to spread it across a number of sessions and first of all lay the foundation, take you through a session, the first session, second session, potentially if there is much to share, the third session. But here's the point. We have been given an opportunity of a lifetime. And I don't think in the last 100 years we've had one like this. I do not believe in the next 100 years we might have another like this. The question is, are you ready? For the first time in history, or forgive me for saying this, in the last 100 years, most governments, especially governments in the West, and governments in some cases in the East, are paying their citizens to stay at home. Now, think about that. Normally, you go to work to get paid. This time around, governments, if you look at the United States, if you look at Europe, if you look at the UK, if you look at Australia or Canada, the Western governments are paying their citizens, their workers, not to work, to stay at home. Why? Because we have a public health crisis. We have a virus, very contagious, highly contagious. And if too many people contact and spread the virus, there is a risk that the public health systems in most countries will fail. And there will be a lot of deaths. And so to mitigate and to reduce the number of deaths and the impact it has on the economic system, people are being paid to stay at home. Now here is where I begin. And I'll say this very quickly. and I'll stop. At the end of the period, we know for now that it would last. This stay-at-home period would last, possibly, potentially, for a minimum of 8 weeks. It could go up to 12 weeks. So for 2 months, you've been paid to stay at home and not work. I feel ashamed, I feel sad to say this, but at the end of the 2-month period, most people will be a lot more unwise than they were before the period began. Why? Because you get skills in 2 ways: life skills and then job skills. When you're working, you're learning. You're doing something, you're producing value, and therefore you're developing yourself. Those who succeed are those who combine investing in themselves, which is the life skills, in getting better, and they combine that with work skills. Most people who work harder on themselves. Most people who work and who succeed in the long term work harder on themselves than they do on any task or job. What that means is that they see themselves as assets. And so human capital is their number one priority. They're happy to do a job at work, but they recognize that productivity begins from within. So they invest in themselves, personal development, learning in how to manage their mind, how to manage emotions, how to be a good leader, how to be a good speaker, how to be a good strategist, how to lead people. They learn how to negotiate, different life skills, how to stay healthy, and then they supplement that with on-the-job training. For that reason, they always stand out from those who only focus on working on their job. And so there's a huge difference. It's partially the reason why in every society there are fewer leaders than there are followers. Because to lead, you must have the skill set, the mindset, and more than anything, the ability to lead. So at the end of this 8-week period, most people would not have gained any knowledge in relation to work. So you haven't improved yourself in your on-the-job ability. In addition to that, most people would have spent between 8 and 10 to 12 hours on social media, television, news, and simply gossip. And what that means is they haven't gained any personal development. They haven't prepared themselves. So at the end of 8 weeks, you've been paid to be stupider, if that's a word, or to be more ignorant than you were before it began. However, that is by choice. Now, let me put into context before I stop. From the economic perspective, if you look at the stock market, there are some companies, not all companies, but there are some companies that have gone down in value by 70%. Some have gone down in value by 60% and some by 50%. In the UK, across all publicly listed companies, we've had a roughly 32-33% drop in value. So that simply means that most companies have lost 30% of their market capitalization. In the United States, it's about 30% on average. But if you look at individual companies, it's roughly, in some cases, close to 75%. Let me put that in context, what that means. If you lose 75% of your value, you fall 75%. To break even, to come back to where you were before the fall, you would have to earn or make 300%. Let that just sink in. You lose 75% of your investment. In order for you to break back to where you were before the loss, you would need to make Not 75%, but 300%. On average, the stock market, on average, in the United States, over a 50-year period, has achieved between 8 and 11%. Most people like to use the 10% mark as the average. In the UK, it varies. It goes from between 6% and up to about 9%, depending on the index. But on average, the S&P 500 has achieved roughly 10%. On average. In the UK, the FTSE 100 has achieved about 6%. The FTSE 250 has achieved something in the region of between 6 and 8%. But let's just keep it at 6%. If it takes you so long to achieve 10%, so every year you make 10% on average. If you use that 10% as your benchmark, as your denominator, and you said, in order for me to make 300%, if you divide 300 by 10, it would mean you would have had to have invested for 30 years to be able to make 300%. Now, that is an arithmetic conversion. If you use the geometric conversion, there's something called the law of 72, or some people use the law of 70 or 71. The law of 71 simply is a process, a simplified process of understanding how long it would take to double your money. It simply means if you earn a 1% interest, it would take you 72 years to double your money. If you were making 10%, it would mean it would take you 7 years approximately to double your money. So to get to 30, so 300%, it would mean you would have to double your money. So you divide 300, think about this. We're saying the law of 72, and you're making 10%, so you divide 72 by 10. It means in 7 years, you double your money. In 7 years again, you double your money. In 7 years, you double your money. So you've doubled your money 3 times. 21 years. So geometrically, if you were using the law of 72 compounded, you would say it would take me 21 years. So 21 years from a geometric perspective and 30 years from an arithmetic perspective means between 21 and 30 years. Now here is something striking. There's been no 2 years in the S&P 500 stock market where you achieved 10 years consecutively. Sometimes the market would do 4, sometimes it would do 15, sometimes you would do 5, sometimes you do negative. So achieving between 8 and 12 is very rare, but on average you can make 10. But here's the point, and I conclude. What that means is that if you invert everything I've said, you've just been given between 21 years and 30 years, extra years of compounding to invest. So the whole idea of inequality or inequity, you can forget that. Why? Because it simply means all those who were ahead of you, the so-wealthy people, so-called wealthy people, have been brought down to a position where you can start the race. The question is, what would you do with the time you've been given? You've been given 21 to 30 years of additional investment time frame. So you starting today and investing intelligently would be like as though you had started so many years ago. That's what we'll do in this session. I'll share some ideas. I hope they help.